In the grand narrative of the Jedi's downfall, what might seem like the swift destruction of the Order at the close of the Clone Wars was, in fact, the result of a long, gradual decline. The prequel trilogy shows that the Jedi's fall began much earlier, with the Council losing its perspective over time. The Sith had a hand in sealing the Jedi's fate, making their decline even harder to pin down. But this wasn't the first time the Jedi had been on the brink of annihilation. Looking back 4,000 years, the Jedi were again nearly eradicated, and this time, they had no one but themselves to blame. In 3952 BBY, the Sith Lord Darth Nihilus wiped out all life on Katar, and in the aftermath, the Jedi Order fell apart. The remaining Jedi Masters, struggling with their own flaws, fear, stubbornness, blind loyalty, and cowardice, made decisions that almost led to their total extinction. It's through examining their actions that we see the deep-rooted issues that plague the Jedi Order, issues that could have been resolved had they been willing to confront them. As the galaxy teetered on the edge of darkness, it was only through the efforts of new, unlikely heroes that the light of the Jedi began to flicker once more, with a new generation rising to rebuild what the Old Order had lost. The Jedi Order's fate was sealed when a catastrophic event struck the Conclave held on a distant planet. In a desperate attempt to confront an ever-growing threat that had been hunting down Jedi, the Council had gathered the remaining Masters in the hope that collective meditation could reveal the path forward. Instead, the gathering was swiftly destroyed, and with it, the Jedi Order crumbled. The few survivors scattered, retreating into exile, leaving behind their lightsabers and their past. This disastrous fall mirrored the Order's long decline, which had begun even before the events that would later unfold, such as the execution of Order 66. The Jedi had struggled to maintain their strength ever since the Great Sith War, a time when many promising young Jedi fell to the dark side and served under a powerful Sith Lord. Even when the Republic called upon the Jedi for aid during the Mandalorian invasions, the Council hesitated, still reeling from previous defeats. It was clear. The Jedi were not the guardians of peace they once were, and their downfall was inevitable. In the grand narrative of the Jedi's downfall, what might seem like the swift destruction of the Order at the close of the Clone Wars was, in fact, the result of a long, gradual decline. The prequel trilogy shows that the Jedi's fall began much earlier, with the Council losing its perspective over time. The Sith had a hand in sealing the Jedi's fate, making their decline even harder to pin down. But this wasn't the first time the Jedi had been on the brink of annihilation. Looking back 4,000 years, the Jedi were again nearly eradicated, and this time, they had no one but themselves to blame. In 3952 BBY, the Sith Lord Darth Nihilus wiped out all life on Katar, and in the aftermath, the Jedi Order fell apart. The remaining Jedi Masters, struggling with their own flaws, fear, stubbornness, blind loyalty, and cowardice, made decisions that almost led to their total extinction. It's through examining their actions that we see the deep-rooted issues that plague the Jedi Order, issues that could have been resolved had they been willing to confront them. As the galaxy teetered on the edge of darkness, it was only through the efforts of new, unlikely heroes that the light of the Jedi began to flicker once more, with a new generation rising to rebuild what the Old Order had lost. She was born with a rare gift, the power to weave invisible bonds through the Force, shaping the hearts of those around her without effort, and her teachers once believed she would rise as one of the greatest of her age. But when the Council forbade action, she chose war, marching at the side of her commander against the Mandalorians. And at Malachor V, she unleashed a cataclysm that claimed soldiers and foes alike. The horror of so many lives torn away shattered her, and to survive, she severed her own connection, leaving behind a wound in the Force itself. When she returned, the Council saw not a fallen knight, but something far more unsettling, an emptiness where the Force should have been. A living challenge to all their beliefs. Unwilling to face what she had become, they cast her out, naming Exile her sentence, and turned their backs on the one who had survived what none of them could endure. After following Revan into war, Surik was exiled by the Jedi Council, who feared what had become of her rather than questioning their own beliefs. For the next 9 years, she wandered the furthest reaches of the galaxy, living in exile, her name forgotten. But when the Sith attacked, believing her to be the last Jedi, Surik returned to the Republic. Despite no longer being a formal Jedi, her heart remained true to the Order. Determined to stop the Sith, she set out to find the lost Jedi, those few survivors who had gone into exile. She tracked down former council members, hoping to unite them against the Sith, only to discover their fears and flaws that threatened the galaxy's future. Each Jedi she found was paralyzed by their own weakness, whether it was stubbornness, blind loyalty, or cowardice. As the Sith closed in, Surik was left to rebuild what the Jedi had failed to protect, training a new generation to rise from the ashes of the past. The Masters, except for one who had already passed away, assembled on Dantooine, where the Exile, Meetra Surik, came before them once more. She sought their aid to confront the Sith, yet they refused, insisting that the true threat had yet to emerge. Their unwillingness to act, their insistence on waiting, and their refusal to ally with Surik led to her being exiled again. Over time, the Masters had come to see Surik as a potential danger. Through her ability to form Force bonds, she could feel the Force once again. The Council believed that the Sith threat was tied to the wound in the Force that Surik carried within her, and if she continued making these bonds, the wound could spread, leading to the death of the Force itself. Rather than trying to understand her condition or join forces against their shared enemy, the Council attempted to sever her connection to the Force once more. Before they could carry out this decision, Kreia intervened, chastised them for their arrogance, and ended their lives. This moment symbolized the flawed nature of the Jedi Council, which had made repeated mistakes that led to the Order's ultimate downfall. Is this conversation helpful so far? Many players of KOTOR 2 walk away from the game feeling puzzled. When speaking to them individually, Kavar and Zez-Kai Ell appear reasonable, having seemingly learned from past mistakes. However, once the Council reunites, they take an unexpected turn, with some players interpreting this as a slip into dogmatism. But there's more to this judgment than meets the eye, and these flaws in the Masters were always there, from the start. To fully understand the Council's final decision, we must examine each of the Lost Jedi, excluding Lonna Vash, whose story remains unclear, and Atris, who was an outlier. Let's begin with Vrook Lamar, the most infamous of the Lost Jedi. His flaws are the easiest to spot. As a Jedi Consular and one of the most powerful Jedi Masters of his era, Vrook had a long tenure on the Jedi Council, starting at least after the Great Sith War. He sat through numerous crises, and in addition to his role on the High Council, he was also part of the council that governed the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine. Vrook spent the majority of his time there, where is this conversation helpful so far? He guided the training of many apprentices and mediated between the Jedi and the settlers of Dantooine, rarely leaving except for council gatherings on Coruscant. His influence in the Order was undeniable. He resolved disputes, upheld strong ties with local leaders, and demanded excellence from those he taught, pushing them toward becoming stronger Jedi. Yet his rigid nature revealed deep flaws. He was relentlessly critical, consumed by suspicion of the dark side, and quick to brand young Jedi as dangerous at the slightest sign of weakness. His stubbornness made him nearly impossible to sway. His sharp judgments cut deep, and his cantankerous temper alienated allies. Unbending in his views, he disdained unorthodox methods and clashed with many who strayed from tradition. During his years on the Council, he presided over critical moments of the Order's history, from the Great Hunt to crises that shook the galaxy, his shadow looming large over victories and failures alike. During the Jedi Civil War, Vrook Lamar stood firm as a vocal critic of the Jedi involvement in the Mandalorian Wars, warning that it would lead many young Jedi to the dark side. His predictions seemed to come true when the conflict escalated into the devastating Jedi Civil War. Vrook, however, did not shy away from condemning Meetra Surik at her trial, believing that she and the others who followed Revan had already been tainted by the dark side before joining the war. Despite his harsh stance, Vrook's contributions were not without merit. He played a pivotal role in exposing the Jedi Covenant's role in the Padawan massacre and bringing its leaders to justice. As the war raged on, Vrook helped manage the crucial Dantooine Enclave, overseeing Jedi efforts and offering aid to the planet's people. His time on Dantooine ended just before its destruction, but after the fall of Qatar, he returned in self-imposed exile, choosing the quiet planet as his refuge. His life was marked by a constant struggle between duty and doubt, with a refusal to compromise his ideals, even in the face of overwhelming crisis. Is this conversation helpful so far? He came to the ruined Enclave, vowing to guard its secrets and keep them from falling into dangerous hands, though in truth, he also longed to see the world once more and aid its people in small ways. His presence was hidden from most, save the planetary administrator who worked with him in secret against mercenary raids. When the Exile arrived seeking him, his reaction was cold, for he had allowed himself to be captured in order to spy on the enemy's plans, only for the Exile to shatter that ploy by freeing him too soon. The mercenary struck earlier than expected, yet Master and Wanderer fought side by side and broke the assault, forcing him to admit his judgment might have been hasty. Together they spoke of the vanishing Jedi and resolved to summon what remained of the Council within the Enclave ruins, after which he departed to begin restoring its shattered halls. Among the lost Jedi, his name stands as the most scorned. For his stubbornness, harsh judgments, and unyielding suspicion lay bare flaws that were impossible to ignore. Vrook Lamar, a character often criticized for his harsh demeanor, has a reputation for being an abrasive, overcautious, and stubborn Jedi Master. His critical nature isn't reserved for others. He's just as harsh with you, making him a figure many people find hard to like. His attitude is a sharp contrast to the more personable and approachable Kavar and Zez-Kai Ell, which only adds to the disdain for him. But beneath that gruff exterior lies a more complex figure. Vrook's flaws, while significant, are not the full measure of who he is. His stubbornness, as grating as it is, stems from a deep-rooted fear of failure and a reluctance to embrace change. In fact, this tendency to criticize others, though unpleasant, is more a reflection of his character's flaws than any inherent malice. His actions, however, are often overshadowed by the friendlier faces of the other Jedi Masters, whose own failings are conveniently overlooked. Vrook's dislike for the player and his grumpy disposition aren't the most significant issues at hand. They are merely the surface-level attributes that make him an easy target for disdain. Ultimately, while Vrook is undeniably flawed, his place in the story is far more nuanced than most people give him credit for. During the Jedi Civil War, Vrook Lamar stood firm as a vocal critic of the Jedi involvement in the Mandalorian Wars, warning that it would lead many young Jedi to the dark side. His predictions seemed to come true when the conflict escalated into the devastating Jedi Civil War. Vrook, however, did not shy away from condemning Meetra Surik at her trial, believing that she and the others who followed Revan had already been tainted by the dark side before joining the war. Despite his harsh stance, Vrook's contributions were not without merit. He played a pivotal role in exposing the Jedi Covenant's role in the Padawan massacre and bringing its leaders to justice. As the war raged on, Vrook helped manage the crucial Dantooine Enclave, overseeing Jedi efforts and offering aid to the planet's people. His time on Dantooine ended just before its destruction, but after the fall of Qatar, he returned in self-imposed exile, choosing the quiet planet as his refuge. His life was marked by a constant struggle between duty and doubt, with a refusal to compromise his ideals even in the face of overwhelming crisis. Is this conversation helpful so far? The tale takes a sharp turn into the defense of one of the sternest figures, showing that while he often came across as cold and unapproachable, he was never truly cruel. In fact, he carried the weight of the Order's burden with relentless resolve, proving himself to be a Jedi who genuinely cared for the people of the galaxy. His time in exile was not squandered in despair, but spent aiding those on Dantooine, a quiet testament to his devotion. His refusal to join the wars was not heartlessness, but a deep fear of the dark side's corruption. A fear history would later prove justified. Ever watchful? Perhaps too much so? He chose paranoia over negligence, vigilance over carelessness. His record was not one of failure alone. He made wise choices too, such as when he stood firm against hidden threats. Even his sharp tongue and harsh lessons were born from a desperate desire to shield his students from falling into shadows that would consume them whole. He was, in every sense, a man who wore his flaws openly, yet carried his virtues just as firmly, a contradiction that made him both frustrating and admirable. He stands as the voice of the Council's authority, defending their choices while carrying a quiet burden of guilt for every apprentice lost to shadow or exile. In the first tale, he may come across as harsh or even arrogant, but when the truth is revealed that the player is the once fallen champion, his suspicion feels less like cruelty and more like caution. His refusal to embrace the reckless plan of retraining a broken warrior and sending them into the heart of danger is, in many ways, the most rational stance of all. Though fate proved him wrong, it could just as easily have vindicated him. Later, when faced with the return of the Exile, his mistrust burns just as fierce. Here is someone branded a traitor, a figure of war and ruin. And while his judgment is rigid and narrow, it is not without reason. His flaw lies in his fear and stubbornness. Yet within his sharp words lingers an uncomfortable truth, that the choices of those who defied the Council's caution helped carve the very wounds that scarred the galaxy. Is this conversation helpful so far? Updated, saved memory. He directly challenges the reasons behind Vrook's harsh judgment, questioning why he's so critical. For the most part, Vrook's views hold weight. Training someone in the ways of the Force was a dangerous venture. The dark side's pull was hard to resist, and those who fell to it often became ruthless killers. In contrast, the light required a constant, unwavering discipline, one that not everyone could endure. Vrook was right to stress that Jedi had to meet high standards to avoid becoming a threat to the galaxy, and that Masters had to hold their apprentices to these standards. However, as this moment highlights, Vrook's approach took things too far. He demanded perfection, something his apprentices could never truly achieve. Setting such impossible expectations wasn't just impractical, it pushed students away, creating a rift between them and their mentors, making it harder for them to ever live up to his impossible standards. Updated, saved memory. He directly challenges the reasons behind Vrook's harsh judgment, questioning why he's so critical. For the most part, Vrook's views hold weight. Training someone in the ways of the Force was a dangerous venture. The dark side's pull was hard to resist, and those who fell to it often became ruthless killers. In contrast, the light required a constant, unwavering discipline, one that not everyone could endure. Vrook was right to stress that Jedi had to meet high standards to avoid becoming a threat to the galaxy, and that Masters had to hold their apprentices to these standards. However, as this moment highlights, Vrook's approach took things too far. He demanded perfection, something his apprentices could never truly achieve. Setting such impossible expectations wasn't just impractical, it pushed students away, creating a rift between them and their mentors, making it harder for them to ever live up to his impossible standard. It was almost as if they were being set up to fail, pushed toward the very path their stern teacher wanted them to avoid. He seemed to realize his part in this, but chose to double down, making matters worse. When students resisted this rigid approach, his answer was often suspicion, believing they were falling to darkness. His vigilance itself wasn't wrong. After all, he had survived a terrible war and seen Masters struck down by their own apprentices. Yet suspicion became his reflex, seeing shadows where none truly lay. He treated anything that could lead to darkness as if it already had, branding even ordinary struggles as dangerous. Anyone less tightly wound than him risked his distrust. In his fear, he exaggerated every danger, his caution so heavy it smothered those who might have stood stronger with a little trust. Ards. Vrook's most critical flaw was his insistence on keeping the Jedi Order out of the Mandalorian Wars, a decision that illustrated his deep-rooted hesitation. While Vrook wasn't opposed to action, as seen in his commitment to aiding the settlers of Dantooine, he was highly cautious when any situation posed a risk of touching the dark side. His excessive wariness clouded his judgment, not only in the Mandalorian Wars, but also during the Great Hunt and the Dark Wars. Vrook even criticized his fellow council members, whom he respected, for acting too impulsively. His over-caution ultimately hindered him from embracing the core duties of a Jedi. Combat, an inevitable part of the Jedi's duty to protect the innocent, sometimes risked drawing a Jedi closer to the dark side, but it was unavoidable. A Jedi's role wasn't to shy away from conflict, but to act in the face of it, regardless of the consequences. He was urged to face the call of darkness rather than run from it, yet time and again he chose avoidance, and in doing so helped unravel the very order he swore to protect. Many branded him dogmatic, but that judgment missed the truth. His flaw was not blind obedience, nor rigid orthodoxy, nor even a belief that the Order was beyond fault. He openly admitted the Council bore responsibility for their failures. His burden was different, a stubborn caution that dulled his light and made him slow to change, wary to act, and suspicious of nearly everyone. Even the galaxy's own measure of alignment revealed his place furthest from the light among his peers. Conviction itself was never his weakness, nor even the reluctance to abandon it without undeniable proof. What doomed him was a fear of misstep so consuming that, when decisive action was most needed, he faltered, and his mistrust spread like a shadow over all who stood beside him. Vrook Lamar's flaws weren't rooted in the Jedi philosophy, but were part of his own troubled character. He had an unsettling tendency to judge people too quickly. With the smallest hint of uncertainty, he he would suspect others of being drawn to the dark side. And even when they proved loyal, he'd be hard to convince. If a Jedi fell to the dark side, he would claim that their descent had been inevitable. For instance, he believed Revan and Malak were already on the path to darkness before their involvement in the Mandalorian Wars. This suspicion extended to the exile, Meetra Surik. Despite having valid reasons to be wary, Vrook's disdain for her went back further, even before her choice to follow Revan. His dislike wasn't based on her actions during the war. Instead, it was his pre-existing judgment, which he twisted to justify his assumptions. Vrook Lamar was the epitome of a stubborn and suspicious Jedi, a master whose judgment was often clouded by his own biases. On Dantooine, when the exile Meetra Surik proved herself by saving settlers from mercenaries, Vrook couldn't see beyond his disdain. He immediately accused her of blaming the Jedi Council for her exile, refusing to believe that her return was motivated by anything more than self-interest. This harsh judgment was not a new trait for him. It had plagued his career, from his early objections to sending Duron Keldroma on a mission to his condemnation of Surik. As the Jedi Civil War unfolded, Vrook became even more insufferable, convinced that the students he had warned against were inevitably falling to the dark side, thus validating his cynical outlook. His refusal to acknowledge the possibility that his biases distorted his perception of others marked one of his greatest flaws, a flaw that, much like some of his critics, prevented him from seeing the whole picture. Ultimately, Vrook's blind judgment contributed significantly to the downfall of the Jedi, a lesson that the exile would learn as she sought a new path for the future. In the meeting of the Lost Jedi on Dantooine, hesitation defined the fate of one Jedi Master. Overcautious and paralyzed by his past mistakes, this master failed to act when it mattered most. His fear was not of the dark side, but of the lives at stake, and in his refusal to trust the help offered by another, he allowed doubt to cloud his judgment. His failure mirrored the disastrous decisions of the past, leading to his own demise at the hands of Kreia. However, his downfall was not an isolated incident. The flaws of the other Lost Jedi, particularly Master Kavar, also played a critical role in the fate of the Order. Kavar, once a revered Jedi Guardian, had a distinguished career as a warrior and tactician. Yet, in the face of impending doom, his unwavering obedience to the Council and his inability to act outside its commands were equally disastrous. Together, their combined failures showcased the tragic flaws that contributed to the downfall of the Jedi Order. A warrior at heart, he lived by the Jedi way, yet carried the weight of choices that shaped the fate of the Order. Resembling others who sought justice through action rather than endless debate, he trained alongside the exile and shared a deep bond of respect and friendship, though duty to the Council kept him from taking her as his student. He believed the Jedi should strike boldly against threats, but when the Council chose silence during the Mandalorian Wars, he obeyed, even as it tore at him. It was his voice that joined in casting the exile away, though he later confessed it was not meant as punishment, but as a path to healing. Through war and false reports of his death, he endured, fighting on the front lines and surviving to guide what remained of the Order. After the massacre at Qatar, it was he who urged the others into hiding, hoping their absence would draw out the enemy, and he placed his faith in the return of the exile, believing she carried the strength to restore what was lost. Kavar, ever the thoughtful Jedi Master, found himself embroiled in the civil unrest of Onderon. While searching for clues about the exile, he became involved in a brewing war, helping Queen Talia resist a coup backed by Sith forces. As Vaklu's plot threatened the stability of the planet, Kavar was forced to stay at the royal palace, unable to pursue his original mission. However, Surik, the exile, arrived to seek him out. Together, they helped defeat Vaklu and his Sith allies, restoring peace to Onderon. With the civil war behind them, Kavar bid farewell to his old friend and left for Dantooine, where he hoped to rally the Jedi Council, now that the Sith had revealed their hand. Throughout his journey, Kavar proved to be the most approachable and reasonable of the Jedi Masters, a stark contrast to his fellow exiles. He didn't waste his exile like Vrook. Kavar remained productive, striving to do what he could for the galaxy's future despite the broken state of the Jedi Order. He moved with purpose, hunting down the Sith while standing firm against the coup that threatened the Republic, and unlike the rigid Vrook, he showed a rare sympathy toward the exile. He confessed that the Council's judgment had been built on fear rather than truth. revealing that her exile was not simply for following the wars, but because they dreaded what she had become after severing her bond with the Force. Though he still held her choices accountable, he admitted the Council's weakness, exposing cracks in their authority. Calm and deliberate, far more reasonable than his counterpart, he was willing to strike at the Sith when others hesitated, even hinting at action against the Mandalorians. When he reappeared on Onderon, he recognized the hand of the Sith in the Civil War and declared it proof that the shadow could no longer be denied, calling for the lost Jedi to rise from hiding at last. He had learned from the failures of the Council, from their silence in the face of crisis, and stood determined to continue the struggle against the Sith, even as others surrendered to despair. Where some masters spoke as though the war had already been lost, he believed that as long as he remained, hope endured. He had shaped the Order's strategy after Qatar, rallying the scattered survivors and holding them to their duty, even in exile, embodying the image of a true Jedi more deeply devoted to protecting the innocent than his peers. His Force alignment reflected this light, stronger than the others, and his words and actions carried the same conviction until Dantooine, where he faltered with the Council, repeating their old mistakes. On Onderon, he demanded that the Jedi rise from hiding and strike back, but when reunited with his fellows, he allowed their caution to silence his resolve. When he returned to the Council, his stance shifted entirely, refusing to take up arms against the Sith because he believed the true danger had yet to emerge. Though he spoke kindly to the Exile and wore the mask of a friend, he still stood with the others in declaring judgment and attempting to strip away her bond to the Force. His reversal left many bewildered, a complete turn from his earlier resolve, and the most common reasoning is that he bowed to the weight of opposition, either outvoted or persuaded by his peers. Yet even that fails to fully capture why someone of such conviction bent so easily, unless one considers his unwavering devotion to the Jedi path a loyalty less fiery than others, but no less binding, and one that ultimately defined both his choices and his contradictions. Is this conversation helpful so far? He was a figure torn between loyalty and conviction, caught in the web of the Council's authority. Even when he admitted their judgments were flawed, his faith in the Order blinded him to the deeper corruption within its walls. His strength was not in rebellion but in obedience. He sympathized with those who defied the Council, yet when it chose silence in the face of war, he yielded. On Dantooine, when the call to resist the Sith demanded action, his own convictions faltered beneath the Council's decree. Noble in spirit, yet shackled by loyalty, he became the voice of compliance, his silence echoing louder than his doubts. Proof that even the strongest beliefs can bend when bound by the weight of an institution. Kavar's confidence in his fellow Jedi was strong enough to sway his judgment, allowing Vrook's cautious reasoning to override his own doubts. Where Kavar saw the Sith's open support of Vaklu as undeniable proof of their hand on Onderon, Vrook framed it as nothing more than bait meant to draw the Jedi into a trap. The argument carried some weight, yet it echoed the same fearful pattern the Council had followed during the Mandalorian Wars, hesitating so long out of fear of corruption that their inaction birthed the very disaster they dreaded. Once again, the Council became so intent on preserving what little remained of their strength for a final battle against the Sith that they never began that battle at all, a choice that would have doomed them had Kreia not struck first. Strategically, Vrook's perspective had its appeal, but Kavar's loyalty blinded him to its flaws. He accepted waiting, convinced there was wisdom and caution, not realizing that neither Vrook nor Zez-Kai Ell truly intended to act. This same blindness shaped their judgment of the Exile, for as the end revealed, only Meetra Surik's return gave the Jedi the strength they could not find in themselves. She stood as the one uniquely equipped to resist the Sith triumvirate, and Kavar, at least in part, understood this, calling on the scattered Jedi to seek her out and even fighting beside her on Onderon. Yet, the Council saw her not as salvation but as danger, a wound in the Force whose bonds carried the power to smother it entirely. Bound by his loyalty to the Jedi way, Kavar let himself be swayed, agreeing that exile and the stripping of her power was safer than risking her aid against the Sith. Unlike Vrook, who saw only failure in the Exile, Kavar respected her and even sympathized with her choices, but he still judged that the peril she embodied outweighed her promise. Even on Onderon, his conviction did not waver. The Council's sentence, born of fear, remained in his eyes justified, no matter how deeply he esteemed the one they had cast out. The war was the reason for exile. Yet the true struggle lay in one master's mind. He saw disobedience to the council as a sin, even when he knew they could be wrong. He admitted they weren't worthy of full trust, but still clung to the belief they must be obeyed. Unlike his harsher peers, he wasn't cruel in enforcing their will, but his fear of defiance chained him to their mistakes, time and again. Too loyal, too hesitant to stand apart. His obedience nearly shattered the very order he swore to protect. He was no villain, he embodied justice. The spirit of a true guardian, but his devotion blinded him, turning faith into weakness. Noble, steadfast, yet unable to rise against the council. He stood as both an example of Jedi strength and a warning of their greatest flaw. Among the last voices of the fading council stood a figure wrapped in mystery, a master whose presence stretched back to the days of the Mandalorian Wars. Unlike his peers, he was never bound entirely by the council's rigid dogma. He questioned their choices, weighed other perspectives, and carried doubts that cut to the heart of the Order itself. When the wandering exile returned during the shadow of the Dark Wars, he did not meet her with condemnation, but with a weary sympathy, recognizing the weight of her choices and the scars she bore. He claimed to have left the Council after the Jedi Civil War, though whether he truly severed ties or simply withdrew from its debates remains uncertain. His cautious temperament suggesting the latter. Yet his bond to the Council lingered, enough for him to join in the desperate plan to feign the extinction of the Jedi and lure out their hunters. Disguised among the desperate of Nar Shaddaa, he moved like a ghost in exile, a thoughtful observer hiding behind the mask of a refugee, embodying both the insight and the quiet fear that defined his path. On the Smuggler's Moon, where the currents of life hid the presence of the Force, the fallen master concealed himself, watching but never acting, letting a year slip by in exile as he abandoned the very identity of a Jedi. Unlike the others who searched for the source of the growing shadow, he did nothing, neither aiding the helpless nor challenging the grip of the syndicates that preyed upon them. It was only when the exile arrived that his silence shattered, for her defiance of the moon's underworld stirred chaos, ignited a war among hunters, and toppled the power of the exchange. Where he had lingered in fear, she stood unyielding, risking everything for strangers. And though her actions shook the order of crime, they left behind a legacy of lives freed, proving that courage could achieve what hesitation never would. He felt the weight of guilt press against him, and it pushed him to once more take up the mantle of Jedi and act. Before the exile departed Nar Shaddaa, he agreed to gather with the remaining council on Dantooine, where they would at last consider striking back at the Sith. In their final conversation, he opened his thoughts to the exile, reflecting on the last decade and the ways it had reshaped his faith in the Order. He spoke of the countless Jedi who had abandoned their path, falling into darkness, and wondered aloud if the fault lay not in the individuals but in the teachings themselves. What troubled him most was the Council's refusal to even entertain such questions, their fear of self-examination standing as its own indictment. To him, nothing revealed the Order's flaw more clearly than how they had treated the exile, choosing judgment over understanding, banishment over dialogue. Among all the lost Jedi, he alone fully recognized how blind the Council had become, and how its resistance to reflection sealed the cracks that would one day shatter it. He once thought the Council flawless, even as their arrogance blinded them and countless Jedi were lost. In truth, they were corrupted, their decisions cloaked in self-deception, their weakness spreading through the Order itself. The more he reflected, the more doubt consumed him, not only in the Council, but in the very idea of the Jedi. That doubt drew him closer to the exile, for he saw no guilt in her or those who followed Revan, only the failure of the Council that abandoned them. To him, their fall to shadow was not proof of corruption, but of betrayal, for isolation had left them vulnerable. The Council had brought ruin upon itself, yet, in a bitter twist, he still returned to Dantooine, still stood with them, even after renouncing his place among their ranks, as if trapped in the very cycle he despised. He proclaims himself a master, yet even as he criticizes the Council's failures, he mirrors them by standing idle when action against the Sith is needed most. He sympathizes with the exile, praises her defiance, even claims her banishment drove him from the Order, yet when the moment comes, he reaffirms her exile and joins the others in trying to strip her of the Force once more. Some call this hypocrisy, an inconsistency in his character, but the truth runs deeper. Among all the lost Jedi, he sees the reality most clearly, though on Dantooine he hides it behind silence. His true nature only emerges on Nar Shaddaa when pressed on why he came there. He speaks of investigating the exchange and its ties to the vanished Jedi, but those with the sharpest awareness sense this is not the whole truth, hinting at something far more buried within him, waiting to be uncovered. He admits the truth. Coming to that place was never about wisdom or insight, it was about hiding. When confronted with fear, his mask cracks, and what emerges is not a misunderstood sage, but a man defined by cowardice. He questioned the Order. He spoke of atonement, but none of it mattered, because when the galaxy needed him most, he ran. He abandoned everyone, buried himself in shadows, and refused to act, not out of reason, but out of dread. This single truth reshapes his whole story. Every choice, every hesitation, every silence reveals the same pattern of retreat. He claimed to have lost faith in the Council, yet he remained among them for years, never challenging, never changing, never daring. He understood more than most, yet he was always too afraid to live by what he knew. Only once did he act in line with his beliefs when he abandoned it all and fled. He trembles under the weight of fear, retreating not out of wisdom, but desperation. And even when principles shift, they ring hollow upon closer inspection. He sees the arrogance festering within the Order, admits his own hand in their downfall, yet rather than seek change, he abandons their path entirely. His words resonate with many, his critique sharp on the surface, but beneath lies little substance. He hints at flaws in the way, yet offers no clarity, no solution, not even proof such flaws exist. The great falls of the past were not born from broken codes, but from failure of action, masters too hesitant, too blind to restrain those sliding into shadow. It was not doctrine that doomed them, but the frailty of those sworn to uphold it. The tale unfolds with sharp comic flair, pointing out that the Republic needed true help, not abandonment, and that the failures of the Jedi lay not in their teachings, but in their leaders who strayed from them. The disasters of the galaxy were not some mystical punishment beyond control, but consequences of poor choices that could have been prevented had courage been shown. The Council, blinded by fear and pride, bore the weight of those horrors. And while one voice tried to frame it as destiny or karmic retribution, the reality was far more ordinary and far more damning. His words of criticism and sympathy might sound wise, even comforting, yet they ring hollow, exposed as clever deflections. Unlike others, who simply dismissed corruption, he recognized it, saw the rot at the top, and even glimpsed his own share of guilt, but still faltered, unable to stand against the truth that stared him in the face. He cannot face the truth that the disaster is partly his doing, nor accept that he has the power to correct it. Fear keeps him from challenging the Council, demanding change, or cleansing the corruption at its core. Instead, he shifts the blame onto the Council, the teachings, even the very essence of the Force, so that the problem appears too vast for him to resolve. It is an excuse, a shield that lets him remain inactive. He becomes the portrait of despair, admitting the crisis exists, yet persuading himself he is powerless to alter it, until he rejects the very bond of the Force that offers healing and hope, dismissing it as nothing more than another curse. In the end, his refusal to act, his repeated abandonment of those in need, proves the bitter truth he spoke he was no Jedi. In the shadow of Nar Shaddaa's refugees and the echoes of the Mandalorian Wars, the somber figure of Zez-Kai Ell revealed his deepest flaw, not wisdom, but fear. He rejected the great truth that bound all life together, the shared strength of the universe, seeing only danger where others saw hope. On Dantooine, his actions took on a bitter irony. Though he whispered to the exile of the Council's arrogance and showed a fleeting sympathy, he lacked the courage to speak those same words among his peers. Unlike Kavar and Vrook, who held fast to their convictions, whether right or wrong, Zez-Kai Ell folded in silence, shrinking back whenever conviction demanded a voice. At every turning point, the Mandalorian Wars, the Exile's trial, the Jedi Civil War, he chose retreat, not resolve. Many claim he was the least flawed of the Masters, but in truth, his cowardice made him the worst of them all. He was not as bluntly wrong as the others, but his failure was far deeper. He glimpsed the truth and chose to hide from it. Instead of facing the flaws that weakened the Order, instead of striving to mend what was broken, he turned away, surrendered to despair, and abandoned his duty to the galaxy he had once sworn to protect. Worse than blind stubbornness is the knowledge of what is right paired with refusal to act, and that was his legacy. The weakness he shared with the rest of the council was not merely personal, but emblematic of a pattern that had plagued Jedi leadership for centuries, driving them into error after error. Their judgment on Dantooine was no isolated mistake, but a repetition of the same blindness that had scarred the galaxy during the wars, a cycle of failure that the Exile was forced to confront when standing before them once again. Is this conversation helpful so far? This time she stepped forward as an ally, offering her strength in the struggle against the Sith, and the Jedi recognized she might hold the key to unraveling this new menace. They knew the strange tactics of their enemy were somehow bound to the wound in the Force carried by the Exile. Yet instead of seeking to understand, instead of embracing what could have been a vital chance to turn the tide, the Council once more chose fear over wisdom. Just as a decade before, they pushed her away, blinded by suspicion and unable to grasp why she could wield such power at all. Faced with a mystery they could not explain, they branded it a threat, labeling what they did not comprehend as corruption, as if ignorance itself was safer than knowledge. There was no darkness in this anomaly, yet their judgment twisted it into danger. This was not the path of true Jedi, who were meant to study the Force in all its depths, to face the unknown with curiosity instead of fear, but the Council, at this moment, had forgotten that calling. The Council's vision had grown so distorted that it turned against what it could not comprehend, condemning the Exile's bond, the wound carried in the Force, and even the way she had been severed and reconnected. After casting her out, they buried her memory until the Sith compelled them to confront it. And only when they could brand it as corruption rather than mystery did they allow themselves to consider it. Through their study of the Sith, they finally glimpsed the truth of the wound, the hunger it created, and how it fueled power by draining life through bonds, which let them see echoes of it in the Exile. Yet their understanding was shallow, their conclusions rash. They saw the resemblance, but instead of recognizing her struggle, they feared her potential. They chose to imagine catastrophe, to see only the threat she might become, forgetting that she remained a living being with choice and will. She stood before them, her every action proving she would never wield her bonds as a weapon, yet the Council could see only shadows of their own fear. They whispered that she drained life, but in truth, her bonds ignited strength, lifting her companions and awakening the Force within them. This was not corruption, but the very heartbeat of the light, the essence the Council had forgotten. Lost in suspicion, they turned blind not only to her, but to the galaxy's peril. When she urged them to face the Sith, they faltered again, repeating the cowardice of old wars, clinging to the illusion that waiting would reveal the enemy. Their logic circled endlessly, a trap of fear and hesitation, while the galaxy cried out for defenders. She had shown through every choice that she would never become what they feared, yet the Council blinded themselves with suspicion, assuming her bonds existed only to drain others when in truth they gave life, awakening companions to the Force instead of silencing them, a reflection of the light itself. But the Masters were so consumed by fear they could not see that truth. And when she urged them to act against the darkness, they repeated the same cowardice as before, hesitating while worlds burned, just as they had in the Mandalorian Wars, convincing themselves that waiting for the enemy to reveal itself was wisdom. Though, by their own admission, the enemy would never do so until the galaxy was already at war, a circle of logic that condemned them as much as their silence. The resurgence of the Sith pushed the Jedi Council into fear, and in that fear, they abandoned their own creed. The highest calling of their path had always been sacrifice, laying down one's life to shield the innocent, but instead they reversed it, choosing to protect themselves at the expense of countless lives across the galaxy. Worse still, they no longer even recognized their betrayal. Their detachment had curdled into apathy, and as an echo once warned, apathy is death. This blindness struck them in the Old Sith Wars and again in the Clone Wars, stripping them of their purpose, to guard the helpless, to seek truth in the Force, and to oppose the darkness. They failed in every one of these duties during the Mandalorian Wars, and the ruin that followed was born of that failure. When their own students chose action where the Masters chose silence, the Council abandoned them, and in that abandonment, those students fell, embracing the shadows, becoming the very enemy they were sworn to fight, and igniting a new war that consumed the stars. They claimed to protect the galaxy, yet their choices brought only ruin. The Council allowed war to spread unchecked, turned away the one who sought to help them, and blinded themselves to the truth staring them in the face. On Dantooine, when offered a second chance, they clung to fear and pride instead of wisdom, repeating the same mistakes that had already shattered their order. Cowardice, suspicion, and blind loyalty marked every word and action until their failings stood exposed not just as the cause of their own downfall, but of the suffering that consumed the galaxy. In the council chamber, the flaws of the Masters stood exposed. Kavar, though uneasy, still bowed to a decision he knew was wrong, echoing the same failings that haunted the Order across centuries. These weaknesses, fear, blind loyalty, and cowardice, were not isolated mistakes, but patterns that resurfaced at the twilight of the Order, shaping every misguided choice until their downfall. In The Lost Jedi, those flaws reached their sharpest point, transforming from mere errors into signs that the Council had strayed from the light itself. Their fear clouded reason, corrupted judgment, and repeated a sentence born of failure long before. Had it been carried out, the galaxy would have been lost to shadow, for without the Exile's aid, the Sith would have triumphed utterly. Yet fate intervened, sparing all but the Masters themselves, whose final act revealed not wisdom, but the tragic proof that they had lost their way. There was far more driving her fury against the Council than what had been revealed. Her true designs belonging to another tale entirely. Deeply flawed and in many ways worse than the Masters she despised, she nevertheless arrived in the crucial moment to spare the Exile, striking at the Council's arrogance and blindness before forcing them to endure the same torment once suffered at Malachor. On Dantooine, the last Masters fell, leaving only one who lingered outside the path of the Jedi and would soon be cast down as well. Though the Jedi were not erased, they were shattered, and only through the Exile would they rise again. Across the galaxy she wandered, seeking the lost Jedi, and in her wake she drew together a crew aboard the Ebon Hawk companions from every corner of life who, through her presence, began to awaken to the Force. Whether by chance or the will of destiny, she gathered a circle of those touched by the Force, and she chose to shape them into a new line of Jedi, apprentices forged from many origins, bound not by tradition but by the lessons of survival and renewal. They all carried their own shadows, yet shared a single bond. They were ordinary souls left behind by the Jedi, scarred by the Council's failures, and shaped by hardships the Masters never understood. That perspective made them the unlikely foundation of something greater, the rebirth of the Jedi Order. On Malachor, the Exile learned that these apprentices, not the Council, were the true Jedi destined to carry the flame. Through her example, they discovered who they truly were, and as she departed once more into the unknown, they remained ready to rebuild. In the end, the future of the Order did not rest with the venerable Masters, but with a repentant killer, a battle-worn veteran, a silent warrior, a fallen Sith, a hidden spy, and a hardened hunter. Together, with the few Jedi still scattered among the stars, they raised the Order anew. And though it thrived only for a time, their lessons burned bright in memory, echoing through the ages. Forgotten and cast aside, the Order sank once more into its own flaws, crumbling toward ruin. Yet this was hardly the first time the Jedi had faced annihilation. Though the Order itself was shattered, its teachings endured, and the last surviving Masters did what those who fell at Dantooine never could. They admitted to at least some of their failings. Not all, but enough. And in that hard-won humility, the darkness was overthrown. As in the aftermath of the Dark Wars, the Jedi emerged again, tempered by experience and wiser for their scars. The lesson of the first Great Purge was not that the Jedi way was doomed by the Council's mistakes, but that those mistakes could be corrected, and no matter how close the brink, the light endured. The flaws of the Council did not damn the path itself. Instead, their failures proved to be the greatest teacher. However costly the consequences, lessons could be drawn, and through new generations and fresh resolve, the Order could be rebuilt, carrying forward what the old could not. And so the tale of the Lost Jedi closes, a mirror held up to the weaknesses that unraveled the Order itself. Fear, stubbornness, loyalty without vision, and the paralysis of doubt. Yet history shows that even after every purge, the light could endure, rebuilt not by the old Masters but by those willing to rise where they had fallen. That was the journey we explored today. A story of failure, renewal, and the fragile hope carried forward. What paths might the students of the Exile reveal if their tale were told? The question lingers, and with it, the promise of more yet to be uncovered.